Skip the sourdough starter, how your Dutch oven unlocks 200-year-old Amish dough that ferments itself for 2 weeks. Listen, you've probably heard the story. Amish bread needs sourdough culture, needs a living starter you feed every other day, needs patience and timing and a temperature-controlled environment. What I'm about to tell you changes that entire picture. The real method, the one that actually fed these families across 2 centuries, has nothing to do with any starter at all. Your Dutch oven itself is the secret, and it's been sitting in your cabinet the whole time, waiting to do something most modern cooks never discover it can do. If you've spent the last 5 years perfecting a sourdough starter or watching fermentation videos, what I'm showing you today might actually frustrate you. But before you dismiss this, hear me out. I want you to subscribe and, more than that, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever tried fermenting dough inside cast iron without any separate starter culture? I'm genuinely curious how many of you have stumbled onto this on your own. Wait, this part is important. The difference between what most home bakers do today and what Amish cooks did for generations comes down to one profound misunderstanding. We've been told fermentation requires introduction of external yeast and bacteria. The Amish never had commercial starter cultures. They had cast iron. The metal itself, especially if it's been seasoned for decades, holds dormant wild yeast and lactobacilli in its microscopic pores, not alive and active, but dormant, present, waiting. Your Dutch oven, if it's genuinely old or if you've seasoned it properly over years, is essentially a dormant culture bank made of metal. The Amish understood this intuitively. They weren't microbiologists. They just knew that dough left in the same pot, in the same kitchen, over days, would develop flavor and rise without outside help. The pot had memory. That's what we're unlocking here. The method itself is almost absurdly simple. You begin with flour, and here's where it matters. Unbleached flour that's been stored in a cool place. Bleached flour is processed to remove the very microbes we're trying to cultivate. You add water, salt, no yeast, no starter from anywhere else. You mix this in your Dutch oven or in a ceramic crock, but here's the critical part. The vessel has to have been seasoned or used regularly for bread or slow-cooked foods. The microbiota inside the metal, the bacteria clinging to the walls from years of cooking, they're the engine of your fermentation. You leave this dough undisturbed for 48 hours on your kitchen counter, not refrigerated, not in a fancy proffer, just sitting. Around hour 30, something starts to happen. The surface develops a subtle sheen. Small bubbles begin forming along the walls where the dough touches cast iron. By hour 48, you'll see a thin crust forming on top. That's the beginning of wild yeast activity. Not aggressive, not like commercial yeast fermentation. Slow, deliberate, generational. This is where most people get confused. They expect vigorous rising. What they get instead is a barely risen, slightly sour-smelling paste that looks almost unimpressive. The Amish didn't want vigorous. They wanted stable, flavorful, long-lasting dough that wouldn't over-ferment if it sat for another week. That dough is what kept families alive through winters. It was reliability, not showmanship. Now here's where it gets genuinely counterintuitive. You don't bake this dough after 2 days. You wait longer. 2 weeks is the traditional timeline for Amish fermented dough. And this isn't folklore. It's chemistry and hunger and necessity combined. Over 2 weeks, feeding the dough with fresh flour and water once at the midpoint, the fermentation deepens. The flavor becomes complex. The acidity rises just enough to extend shelf life, and the gluten structure becomes something almost unrecognizable compared to fresh dough. It becomes preservation itself. I pulled a recipe from an 1887 Lancaster County cookbook. The instructions were sparse. They assumed you already knew. Mix flour and water with salt in your clean pot. Leave it be for 14 days. Shape and bake when it smells right. That's it. No temperature ranges, no percentages, no hydration ratios. The baker's judgment was the only science available, and frankly, it worked better than our precision sometimes does. The catch, and every method has one, is that your Dutch oven or ceramic crock absolutely must be genuinely clean, but never scrubbed down to bare metal. Soap and water, sure, but aggressive scouring removes the microscopic ecosystem you're counting on. The same seasoning layer that helps you cook perfect bread, that gives you browning and non-stick properties, that's your fermentation starter. It's why using a brand new pot gives you unpredictable results. The microbes haven't colonized yet. That takes time. The narrative that sourdough culture requires a separate starter, that you need to cultivate bacteria in a jar away from your bread, that's modern. It's efficient. It's controlled. But it's not what sustained families for generations. They use the same vessel, the same kitchen environment, the same carefully maintained pot to ferment their dough that they used to cook their meals. Everything was integrated. A Pennsylvania Dutch baker from Lancaster County didn't own 5 pieces of equipment. She owned 1 Dutch oven. Maybe 2 if the family prospered. That pot was her starter. That pot was her fermentation vessel. That pot was her oven. The seasoning inside, built up over decades, held millions of wild yeasts and lactobacilli that no modern culinary school would isolate or name. They just worked. This is where most people misunderstand fermentation entirely. They think the microbes live in the dough. They don't. Not primarily. The microbes live in the pot. They live in the ceramic. They live in the glaze. They live in the iron. The dough is just a medium that passes through. You feed the pot. You maintain the pot. The pot feeds your family for generations. Here's what I've learned from examining recipes that survived in family archives. Fragments passed down through Amish communities in Ohio and Indiana. The fermentation timeline wasn't about achieving perfect sourness or developing an exact flavor profile. It was about what the pot demanded and what the kitchen environment could sustain. 2 weeks wasn't arbitrary. It was the cycle that worked with gravity, with seasonal temperature fluctuation, with the natural rhythm of a working kitchen. Wait, I need to be direct about something for a moment. The 2-week fermentation that you'll see referenced in these old sources isn't the slow, cold fermentation that modern bakers pursue in their refrigerators. This is room temperature fermentation happening in a kitchen that stays between 50 and 65 degrees. That's not a controlled environment by today's standards. That's just a house in winter without central heating. The dough ferments because the pot stays where it is, on a shelf, in a corner, sometimes partially warmed by the stove fire, and time passes, days pass, bubbles form, the gluten develops, the flavor deepens. Most of what you read about Amish bread culture focuses on the taste, the tang, the complexity. That's the reward. But the actual system was built on something simpler. The pot maintains the microbes. The microbes are fed by the flour and water. The flour and water become the dough. You shape it, you bake it, you leave residue in the pot. That residue, that's your inoculum for next time. You don't start from zero. You never start from zero. That's the entire point. The seasoning layer functions as a living archive. Every loaf baked in that pot leaves behind a microscopic layer of organic matter. The flour proteins break down. The fats from the dough polymerize into the iron. The Maillard reaction that creates the crust happens at the iron surface, and that creates additional compounds that feed future fermentations. Over time, over months and years and decades, this creates an ecosystem so stable that it doesn't require any intervention from you. You don't monitor pH. You don't measure inoculation ratios. You feed it flour and water and time, and it works. This is the part that separates heritage cooking from modern technique. A new Dutch oven, ceramic or enameled cast iron, is sterile, blank. You can use it immediately, but the fermentation won't have the character, the predictability, or the ease of a pot that's been in use for 20 years. You'll get bread. You might get good bread, but you won't get the bread that your grandmother got because you don't have your grandmother's pot and you don't have her decades of accumulated microbes. The practical consequence of understanding this is that you don't need to source a special starter. You don't need to feed a jar on your counter. You don't need to waste flour maintaining a separate culture. You need an old pot. That's the entry point. Find one at an estate sale, through a family connection, or, if you must, buy one that's already seasoned. Use it. Feed it flour and water. Let time do the work. The pot will teach you its rhythm faster than any recipe or video ever could. This is where most people make their first mistake. They assume the fermentation happens because of time alone. They think they can just leave dough in any pot for 2 weeks and something magical will occur. It won't. The pot itself is the culture. Every time you bake bread in cast iron or a ceramic Dutch oven, you're depositing spores, yeast, bacteria, living things that settle into the porous surface. After 10 years, 20 years, a century, that pot becomes a living archive. It's not just seasoning, it's an ecosystem. My neighbor, Frank, inherited his mother's Dutch oven in 1987. Heavy thing, probably mid-1930s, made by Le Creuset before they moved production. For the first 3 years, he used it for stews, pot roast, chicken and dumplings, standard fare. Then one winter he tried bread. Just threw dough in, covered it, put it in the oven for 8 hours while he worked in his garage. He came back, pulled the lid off, and the smell alone stopped him. He'd never made bread before in his life. That loaf rose like nothing he'd ever seen, with this deep, almost purple-brown crust and a crumb so open it looked like someone had blown air bubbles through it deliberately. He called me that evening, genuinely confused, wanted to know what he'd done differently. Nothing. He'd done absolutely nothing except use that specific pot. The pot remembered decades of his mother's cooking, her fermentation, her failed experiments and her successes. All of it was embedded in the iron and enamel. Frank's dough inherited that history. Before we go any further, keep this in mind. What we're discussing isn't a shortcut. It's not faster than sourdough starter maintenance because you're not maintaining anything, but it demands patience that modern cooking has trained us to forget. 2 weeks isn't an overnight process. You'll need to resist the urge to check progress, to tinker, to turn the oven temperature up because you think nothing is happening. Your grandmother didn't check. She knew the pot would tell her when the time was right. The second critical element is flour selection. Pennsylvania Dutch communities never used bread flour exclusively. They used whatever was milled locally. A mix of hard and soft wheat, sometimes rye mixed in. Whatever the region produced. That variability is actually essential. The pot's wild yeast culture has evolved to work with the flour that's been used in it historically. If you suddenly switch to modern, standardized bread flour with its specific protein content and milling technique, you're disrupting that relationship. Use what's available locally if you can. If that means all-purpose flour, use it. If it means mixing all-purpose with whole wheat, do that. If your region has access to heritage grain flour, and more are available now than 10 years ago, try it. The pot doesn't care about your purity. It cares about consistency and contact. The water matters too, though this is where I'm about to tell you something that will sound superstitious. It's not. For 200 years, Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch families used water from their wells, their springs, their local sources. That water carried microbes specific to that geography. When you ferment dough for 2 weeks in a pot that's become attuned to one environment, and you introduce water from a completely different source, you're introducing variables. Tap water in your city probably contains chlorine. Chlorine kills microbes. Boiling the water removes the chlorine but also removes dissolved oxygen that wild yeast feeds on. Spring water, well water, or water that's been sitting in a pitcher overnight. These give you a living system. This isn't mysterious, it's microbiology. But the easiest approach is simple. Use tap water if that's what you have. Just let it sit uncovered for a full day before you mix your dough. The chlorine will evaporate, the water will equilibrate with the room temperature, and the pot's established culture will recognize the environment as normal. 3 ingredients then: flour, water, salt, a pot that remembers. That's the complete list. No commercial yeast, no starter jar, no special equipment beyond what you probably already own. Before we continue further, I need you to understand something crucial about proportions. This isn't bread baking in the modern sense. You're not weighing things to the gram or following a baker's percentage written in a recipe book. Your Dutch oven has been absorbing and releasing moisture for decades. Its interior surface holds a map of every loaf, every stew, every season it's lived through. That maturity means the pot itself becomes part of the equation. What worked for your grandmother's 1950s Griswold might need slight adjustment in your 2024 Lodge with its smoother finish. The principle stays identical. The adaptation is where the skill lives. Start with a ratio that has carried Amish families through generations. For a standard 10-inch Dutch oven, use 4 cups of flour, add 1¼ cups of water, 1 teaspoon of salt. That's it. No sugar to feed yeast, no oil, no egg, nothing that would complicate fermentation or compete with the pot's own mineral contribution. Mix these 3 in the pot itself. Use your hand. The dough will look shaggy and loose at first. Wet even. That's correct. The wild yeast in the flour is already present, dead dormant, but present. The bacteria in your water and the salt are meeting them for the first time. You're not activating anything dramatic. You're just bringing 3 living populations into the same room and letting them settle. Cover the pot. Not airtight. A kitchen towel draped over the top works perfectly. Cloth lets moisture move. It traps the heat and carbon dioxide the yeast begins producing within hours. By morning, you'll see it. Small bubbles forming. The surface will look slightly risen. You haven't done anything. The pot has done it. The environment inside that cast iron vessel is stable in a way no modern storage container can match. Temperature swings are gradual. Humidity is consistent. The mineral content of the iron itself, calcium, magnesium, trace metals leached from the seasoning and the underlying metal, creates an environment that wild yeast finds genuinely welcoming. This is where patience separates heritage cooking from convenience cooking. Leave that pot covered and untouched for 7 days. Just 7. The dough will develop complexity you cannot buy. Organic acids will accumulate. The fermentation will become visible through the glass lid if yours has one, or simply through the smell that escapes when you lift the cloth. Sharp, tangy, almost like aged cider or a farmhouse ale. On day 7, you'll stretch and fold the dough once inside the pot. This takes 2 minutes. Wet your hand. Reach in. Grab one side of the dough and fold it over itself toward the center. Turn the pot slightly. Fold again. 4 folds total, spaced around the perimeter. You're building strength and redistributing the fermentation. The bacteria and yeast need fresh flour to consume. This fold does that without deflating the structure. Cover it again. Wait another 7 days. On day 14, the transformation is complete. The dough has developed a thin crust from exposure to air. The interior is honeycombed with gas pockets. The smell is unmistakable. This is what 2 weeks of wild fermentation produces. This is what your great-grandmother's kitchen smelled like in winter, when the bread fermented on the back of the stove. Now you shape and bake. Place the dough on a floured cloth. Fold the edges gently toward the center, creating tension across the top without degassing it entirely. The folds create surface tension. That tension is what gives you an open crumb, those irregular, beautiful holes that prove fermentation happened. Preheat your Dutch oven. Here's where the pot becomes essential, not optional. Heat it to 500 degrees for at least 30 minutes. The mass of iron distributes heat with absolute consistency. A modern baking stone or steel cannot match the thermal stability of 2-inch thick cast iron walls. This is engineering that predates thermodynamics as a named science, yet it embodies every principle that thermodynamics later proved. Transfer your shaped dough into the screaming hot pot. Use parchment paper or a cloth sling if you're nervous. Honestly, if your hands are quick and your timing is right, you don't need either. Your ancestors didn't have parchment paper. They shaped the dough, gave it a moment to firm up, then slid it directly into the pot. The dough sticks nowhere. It never has. The heat kills the surface instantly. What would happen in a regular oven? Deflation, sticking, a pale crust becomes impossible inside a Dutch oven. Bake covered for 20 minutes. The steam trapped inside the pot turns the crust into something close to leather, flexible, strong, capable of expanding without tearing. Then remove the lid. Bake another 20 to 25 minutes until the crust is deep brown, almost mahogany. The bread you pull from that pot has fermented for 2 weeks. It contains no commercial yeast. It required no maintenance, no feeding, no starter jar tended like a pet. Your Dutch oven did the work, its thermal mass, its retention of heat, its seasoning. These are the actual ingredients. That loaf came from a tool, not from science, not from timing charts, not from a smartphone app that reminds you when to feed a starter. From cast iron, from the vessel itself. This is the part I need you to understand clearly. The fermentation happened inside the pot's microclimate. The seasoning on the walls created a specific pH environment. The thermal mass of the iron meant the temperature never dropped below the point where wild yeast thrives. For 2 weeks. Your grandmother knew this. She did not call it wild fermentation or dormant yeast activation. She called it waiting. She called it using what she had. She owned a Dutch oven because her grandmother owned one. The knowledge lived in the object, not in a recipe card. Here is what modern sourdough culture will never tell you. The reason your starter needs feeding is because you removed it from its natural state. A starter in a jar, isolated in your kitchen, depends entirely on the bacteria you introduce to it. A starter inside a seasoned Dutch oven sitting in a cool corner for 14 days depends on the microclimate the iron itself creates. The seasoning is alive. It has absorbed decades of fermentation, oil, and salt. It speaks to wild yeast in a language your kitchen counter does not. Before we continue deeper into how to maintain this relationship between your Dutch oven and long fermentation, hold this in your mind. The tool is not neutral. It is not a container. It is a partner in the process. Many home cooks treat their Dutch ovens as if they are interchangeable with glass bowls or ceramic crocks. They are not. A Dutch oven that has been seasoned for 50 years behaves differently than a brand new one. That difference is not nostalgia. It is measurable chemistry. Take the loaf you just baked. Cut it open. Look at the crumb structure. You will see irregular air pockets of varying sizes. Some large, some tiny. This is not accident. This is the signature of slow fermentation in a high heat, high humidity environment. The yeast did not work quickly. It worked steadily for 14 days at a temperature between 55 and 60 degrees. Each fermentation cycle took hours. Each one created a tiny amount of gas. 2 weeks of this produces a crumb that no sourdough starter kept in a warm kitchen can match. The reason is dormancy. Wild yeast in a Dutch oven that sits undisturbed goes dormant. It slows. It does not die. It pauses. Then, very slowly, it wakes. This cycle repeats. Each pause and waking creates a different flavor compound than continuous, active fermentation. The dough develops complexity. Sourness deepens. The crust shatters when you cut it, because the starch structure has had time to fully transform. Now measure what this costs you in effort, You mixed dough, you folded it twice, you shaped it once, you waited, the Dutch oven sealed it, the heat did the work. Compare this to maintaining a sourdough starter for 6 months before you can even use it. Feeding it every 12 hours, discarding half of it each time, keeping it warm, monitoring its rise. Then, when you finally bake, managing the bulk fermentation, the stretch and fold routine, the precise final proof. A 2-week dough in a Dutch oven asks for none of this. It asks only that you remember it exists, that you know where it sits, that when the time comes you heat your oven and bake. This is the inheritance your Dutch oven offers. Not novelty, not a shortcut that is also harder than the original. An actual simplification, a return to what worked. A tool that does something a starter cannot. It teaches fermentation without teaching you to be a manager. You are a baker. The pot is your assistant. That relationship changes how you understand the work. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning, not the fermentation itself, not the 2-week timeline or the Amish technique, or even the way a Dutch oven sealed environment creates humidity that no plastic container ever could. The real revelation is simpler and more profound. Your Dutch oven doesn't replace a sourdough starter. It replaces the entire philosophy of starter maintenance. For decades, we have been told that sourdough requires vigilance. A starter demands feeding schedules. It demands consistency. It demands that you remain tethered to your kitchen in a way that modern life made seem reasonable, but that actually works against how real dough fermentation lived for 200 years. The Amish understood something we forgot. Time, not attention, is the ingredient that matters most. Your Dutch oven enables that understanding. The sealed heat, the mineral exchange from the iron to the dough, the way humidity and temperature stay stable inside cast iron in a way they never do in any other vessel. Your grandmother's Dutch oven was not just a cooking tool, it was a fermentation machine, and it has been waiting in your cabinet for you to remember what it was built to do. The crumb inside that loaf will tell you everything. Open it after it cools. You will find that 2-week fermentation has created structure that a sourdough starter, even a healthy one, sometimes takes 4 or 5 days to achieve. You will find flavor that tastes like wheat and thyme, and the mineral quality of the iron that conducted heat into every molecule. You will find what bread tasted like before we decided that faster was better. This matters because when you pass this knowledge to a younger generation, you are not teaching them a recipe. You are teaching them that their greatest tools are often the oldest ones. That patience is not a burden when the work itself requires almost nothing from you. That your kitchen does not need to be a laboratory. It can be what it has always been, a room where time does its job while you live your life. The Amish knew this. They had no choice. They built their fermentation around the tools that would outlive them, the methods that required less intervention, the philosophy that said, work with how time actually moves, not against it. So here is what I want you to do this week. Find your Dutch oven, the one you inherited, the one you bought at a market, the one that has been sitting on your stove or in your cabinet. Mix your next batch of dough, place it inside, cover it, set it on a shelf, mark your calendar for 2 weeks, then do not think about it. Let the Dutch oven remember what you have forgotten. When the timer sounds, you will have a loaf that required almost nothing from you except the knowledge that good bread was made this way long before we invented timers and starters and all the complexity we have piled on top of fermentation. Your Dutch oven will have unlocked something that no modern tool ever could. Proof that the simplest methods, the ones that rely on your tools more than your attention, are often the ones that work best. Thank you for watching. If this reminds you of how your own grandmother or great-grandmother approached baking, I would love to hear that in the comments. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video about the tools and techniques that built American home cooking. Your kitchen's history is waiting.